This is the lecture for chapters 16, 10, and 7. These chapters are specifically devoted to your persuasive speeches. Let's get started. Both your next speech and the final speech are persuasive speeches. Unlike the informative speech, where your purpose was to educate your audience about your topic, the purpose of your persuasive speech is to change the audience's attitudes, values, or even their behaviors related to your topic. Depending on the topic, that could be an important job. Ethical behavior is very important when it comes to persuasion. Things like coercion, bullying, or manipulation should never be used when trying to persuade people. Honesty and good solid evidence and reasoning, not misleading or incorrect information, should be the basis of your arguments. Advocacy goes beyond understanding and seeks to gain support for a specific viewpoint or policy change. Attempts at persuasion arise from controversy, and controversy can occur at 4 levels: fact, value, personal action, and policy. To put it simply, fact has to do with whether something is true or false. Value has to do with whether something is good or bad. Personal action has to do with whether an audience should take a particular action, and policy has to do with whether an organization, institution, or government should take a particular action. Different types of controversy require different ways to approach argument in persuasive speeches. Let's look at each one of these types of controversies and examples of them. FYI, your next speech, the persuasive speech, will be a policy speech, and your final speech will be a personal action speech. First, persuading about facts. Persuading about facts has to do with attempting to convince an audience that a particular view of the facts is the correct or incorrect view, depending on what your view is and what their view is. Here's an example of a speech having to do with facts. The topic is flat earth theories. The specific purpose, to persuade the audience that flat earth theories have no basis in fact. The thesis statement: despite the loud protestations of a small percentage of conspiracy theorists, there is no legitimate evidence that the Earth is anything other than a sphere, or to be more precise, an oblate spheroid. The first main point: some small percentage of people believe that the Earth is flat. Second main point: however, all available scientific data has proven this to be incorrect. Now, the way you would approach this would really depend on your knowledge of the audience. Does your audience generally agree with you on this? Maybe they've heard of these theories and wondered about them, or maybe they know people who think this way and would like to know why they think this way, and also would like to maybe have some good solid evidence to share with them about why they're incorrect the next time the topic comes up. Or are these people who do think this way and might be considered a hostile audience, in which case you'd really need to be careful about how you approach this topic with them. People don't necessarily like to be wrong, but helping people be open to seeing things differently can create a dramatic change. The book says that you should acknowledge that you don't want them to feel as if you're belittling them or dismissing their views. But you should definitely provide evidence to show that what they believe is flawed and provide additional evidence that contradicts their existing belief. Then provide a new, clear, unambiguous belief as a statement of fact that overrides their old belief. Quality source citations supporting this new belief will add credibility. So obviously you're going to need lots of evidence, reasoning, and also a lot of understanding and compassion to get your point across to your audience. Persuading about values. Speakers may need to persuade the audience that the issue they're arguing about affects one of their deeply held values, persuading them of its goodness, morality, or quality. Here's an example of a persuasive speech where the speaker is attempting to persuade the audience that they should value their family relationships over their success at work. The topic here is valuing success over family. The specific purpose: to persuade the audience that they should value their family relationships over their success at work. The thesis statement: while we all want to be successful in our work lives, it's more important that we have successful relationships with our loved ones. Main point 1, work goals are important and we all need to be successful. Main point 2, more important, however, is our need for our family relationships to be successful. Main point 3, we must not ignore our family relationships in order to seek success. So, in this case, the speaker will need to acknowledge in the first point that indeed it is important to be successful in the workplace, and then introduce what they believe is the more important value, that of success in family relationships, establish why it's important, and then establish why it is indeed more important than the first value. This next level of controversy is persuading an audience about taking a personal action. This is actually the basis of lots of advertisements, where you're given a reason to buy a particular product. In this case, however, it's you helping the audience to realize that they're not taking an action that they probably should be taking, mostly because of some perceived difficulty or cost like time or money or just unfamiliarity. So they need some kind of motivation to make it in their best interest to take that action or do that thing. This form of persuasion is called motivated sequence, and it's a 5-step process: attention, need, satisfaction, visualization, and action. Now, since this is the basis for your last speech, I'll be talking more about it in the last module. I want to move on, though, to disagreements of policy, which is the basis of the speech that you'll be giving next. When we argue about policy, we're moving beyond personal action and instead advocating for change in a rule, a law, or a policy in an organization like a company or an institution like a school or a government. It's not too difficult to look around us and see that there are lots of things that need to be changed or fixed. But when we do speeches like this, it's more than just sitting around complaining. We need to be specific. We need to be able to say exactly what the problem is, who's being harmed, what is the cause or causes of the problem, and what are some solutions to the problem, and how will they help to alleviate or fix the problem. So let's apply this to the persuasive speech assignment prompt. For the persuasive speech, you'll pick a topic of local interest or concern, something that affects us here in Southern Nevada. Research it and prepare a 5 to 8 minute policy speech. Your job is to help the audience to see how important this issue is to them and to convince them that there are things that can and should be done to improve the situation. Let's say I'm interested in mental health resources in Southern Nevada. It doesn't take me too long to discover through some research that mental health resources here in Southern Nevada are dismal. We are ranked 39th in the U.S. for mental health for adults and 51st for youth. That's horrible. So here's what I decide to do for my persuasive speech. My topic: youth mental health in Nevada. My specific purpose: to persuade the audience that there should be strong funding for all levels of youth mental health care in Southern Nevada. My thesis: Southern Nevada ranks 51st in the nation in funding for youth mental health care. We need strong funding at all levels of treatment. My first main point is the problem. Due to both structural and attitudinal causes, Nevada ranks at the bottom of the country for youth mental health care. Main point 2 is my solution. We need more funding for youth mental health that includes all levels of care, including inpatient, outpatient, and other types of interim care. So, where the problem is concerned, I need to talk about that the causes are both structural, which is how the funding for it has been ignored for decades, and attitudinal, that the attitudes toward mental health have been treated poorly for decades as well. Then for the solution, that the money should not just be spent on inpatient and outpatient treatment, but on the different kinds of what's called interim care as well. So that's a good example of a persuasive speech, and we'll talk more about this in class. So try looking at these exercises that are listed on this page underneath the video to see if they can help you put your persuasive speech together. Emotion and narrative. One of the most profound ways that we can be persuasive is through our emotions. Pathos, or emotional appeal, is one of the ways that Greek rhetorician Aristotle said people can be swayed to agree with you. It may be more persuasive than evidence and reasoning, which isn't necessarily a good thing, but it is an important thing. It's intuitive, it's based on our passions and our values, and if you use it correctly and ethically, you can craft a truly moving presentation. The way that you do that is by expressing the emotion in yourself that you want to evoke in your audience. And if you do that, you can communicate with your audience by creating shared identities, experiences, and values. What does that mean? Stories from your own or others' lives, examples, narratives, etc., that evoke an emotion you want your audience to feel about the topic. One of the best ways to do this is by using a short example or story for your hook, which is the opening statement in your introduction that leads into the topic. For example, here's a hook or attention getter for the persuasive speech about youth mental health in Southern Nevada. Kiana was only 14 years old when she almost lost her battle with mental health here in Southern Nevada. She had been in outpatient treatment, but it hadn't been working well, and her parents were desperately waiting for a bed to open up at Oasis Treatment Center, the only Medicaid-approved inpatient facility in Southern Nevada, which was all they could afford. Then Kira attempted to take her own life, but she was fortunately found by her mother before she succeeded. Amazingly, a space for her opened up at the facility and she was admitted. But Kira was simply lucky. For many other teens with mental health issues in Southern Nevada, luck is not on their side. So with a story like this, you and your audience might be feeling things like sadness, compassion, maybe a little anger or frustration at the system for letting things get this bad. Those are the kinds of emotions that you could feel. Here's the thing. I really believe that emotions are the icing on the argument cake. Too much emotion with too little evidence is how mobs and riots happen. And that's not what we're going for here. On the other side of the spectrum, a bunch of dry facts with no emotion attached will do nothing to persuade your audience of anything. Emotion and reasoning are most effective when they're integrated. Reasoning gives audiences the tools to think critically about the ideas and events they care about, but emotion tells them why they should care. You can use evidence and reasoning to evoke emotions that move your audience to take action. Wait, did I just say that you can use evidence and reasoning to evoke emotion? Yes, I did. Let me show you how. Here's a bar graph that gives evidence to show that at every educational level, there is still a gap between men's and women's income. So no matter how much education a woman gets, she's still likely to make less than a man with the same education. Not particularly fair. So this piece of evidence definitely evokes the emotions of frustration and righteous anger, especially if you're a woman. Here's another one. This bar graph should evoke concern or even fear, maybe surprise if you didn't realize this. It shows comparative driver reaction time when at the legal drunk driving limit, high on cannabis, hands-free calling, and texting and driving. And as you can see, reaction time is way slower for texting and driving than any of those other things. Not that you should do any of those other things either, but it's pretty obvious that texting and driving is really bad. And hopefully this picture evokes feelings of caring and concern in you. It's an image of Ukrainian refugees crossing into a neighboring country, not sure which one, to get away from Russians bombing their city back in 2022. Basically, people carrying their kids and as many possessions as they could, trying not to die. Too much of that going around these days. Hopefully we still have some compassion left for this. And of course, there's nothing wrong with evoking happiness. Now, frankly, most persuasive speeches are problem-solution oriented, and most solutions aren't perfect, but they may make things somewhat better. So you could certainly have something that evokes happiness in the conclusion. It definitely needs to fit with the topic, though. Maybe for the youth mental health speech, it does have a happy ending, like Kira got the treatment she needed and ended up graduating from high school. Wouldn't that be great? Then having that as the end of the speech, maybe with a picture of her in her graduation gown. And saying that with more and better funding, that could be the story for more Nevada teens. Wow, that would be powerful. Emotional appeals are crucial in any public presentation, but certainly in your persuasive speech. Okay, let's move on to one of the most important chapters in this book, Chapter 7, Evidence and Reasoning. Pay attention, it's important. The evidence you use to make your case matters. An effective public speaker gathers multiple types of evidence to support their thesis, uses that evidence to better understand their topic, ensures their reasoning is sound, and then adapts their evidence and reasoning to their audience. Apart from building your credibility, your first-hand knowledge and personal experiences can also provide important evidence to support your cause. These are the main categories of evidence. Facts. Now, don't confuse facts with opinions. Just because you think something is fact doesn't mean it is. I'm talking about good, solid facts that you find from good, solid, credible sources. Facts are statements of information that are generally known, accepted, or proven to be the case. Here's an example. Citing the large number of post-election lawsuits related to the 2020 election that were thrown out due to lack of evidence or for being frivolous and without merit, in order to support the idea that the election was free and fair. Now, if you're trying to prove that the 2020 election was not fraudulently won by Joe Biden, you can use this fact that practically every lawsuit that Trump filed in practically every state that claimed there was funny business with the vote counting and certification was thrown out due to lack of evidence and being frivolous and without merit to support the idea that there was no funny business and that the election was free and fair. Obviously, you'll need more than this one piece of evidence, but that's a good piece of evidence. That is a fact. Then, demonstrations. Demonstrations are letting your audience personally see, hear, touch, or otherwise experience an event or effect. Demonstrations can be good in persuasive speeches. We don't use them a lot in persuasive speeches, but just last semester, I did have a student who used one. She was like the counselor for her former high school's after-school robotics team, and they were really good. They went to the state championships with their robot, and her thesis was that the district should keep funding programs like this because they were important. So she brought her robot to class, and it walked around and threw stuff at us. It was pretty cool. So the example of showing your award-winning robot to demonstrate that after-school programs like robotics are worthwhile and should not be cut. That is a good piece of evidence. Then there's testimony. Testimony is very much important in persuasive speeches. Testimony is an account of an individual's observations, knowledge, and experiences. There are a couple of types of testimony. There's pure testimony and expert testimony. Peer testimony is testimony from people like ourselves who are not experts but have some kind of experience with the topic, like this example. Personal story from an employee who's shifted to remote work and the benefits they experienced to help support the idea that more companies should allow work from home options. There's also expert testimony. Obviously, that is a person who has some kind of education, experience, knowledge, and their work revolves around this particular topic. So in this case, the expert testimony is a business professor who studies remote work and says that remote workers are often more productive than those who work in the office. Those are both good examples of testimony. Finally, we have statistics, which is the collection, analysis, and interpretation of numerical data. Usually somebody's already done the collection, analysis, and interpretation for you. You've just got to find it. Now, people tend to trust statistics more than other types of evidence, but you have to be careful because statistics can be misleading, so you need to make sure you're using them correctly. But they can put things into perspective and make those things more understandable. For instance, if your speech is about the problem of child neglect in Nevada and you're focusing on some of the causes, you can point to this statistic that is shown on a graph. So you show a graph comparing the number of children in Nevada removed from a home and put into foster care due to neglect, 89%, to the number nationwide, which is 65%, to point out that adult mental health is a major contributing factor in child neglect in Nevada. So the statistic proves that many adults suffer with untreated mental health issues to the point that their children are neglected and have to be taken away from them. You could use that statistic to argue for more mental health care for adults, along with better family support to care for neglected children. So you can't just throw evidence out there and hope the audience comes to the conclusion you want them to come to. You've got to help them get there. That's what reasoning does. It helps you and your audience understand how the evidence supports your thesis. Reasoning is the process of coming to conclusions. Logical reasoning makes clear connections between the evidence you provide and the conclusions you draw from that evidence. Sometimes those links are obvious, but sometimes you have to do a bit of explanation. There are a few different ways that we reason. We reason from principles, which is also known as deductive reasoning. We reason from examples, which is also known as inductive reasoning. And we reason by comparison, which is known as analogical reasoning. Now, we do these things every day. You probably just don't realize it. Let's look at these different kinds of reasoning. Reasoning from principles, or deductive reasoning. Principle is a theory, rule, or definition that applies to all cases in a given category. Deductive reasoning is reasoning from a general principle to a specific example. To reason from a general principle, you state the principle, you apply the principle to the example, and then you draw the conclusion. Here's an example. Fraud is when someone intentionally misrepresents a fact and someone else believes them and is harmed by acting on that belief. The person who sold me this phone on Facebook Marketplace said it was a Samsung product, and I bought it thinking it was genuine and paid good money for it. However, it turned out to be a fake, and they later admitted they knew it. Plus, it was defective and unfixable. Since they told me something they knew was not true, and I was harmed by acting on it, what that person did was fraud. As you can see by the color coding, the yellow part is the principle, the blue part is the example or the thing that happened, and the green part is the conclusion that what happened in that instance was fraud because it meets the definition of fraud. So that's your argument. We also reason by examples. That's what inductive reasoning is. When you do this, you use specific cases to illustrate a concept for the audience to help them understand what you're talking about. Now, just remember that one example of something doesn't really prove anything. It's just one example. It can help illustrate something. If you want to prove something with examples, you have to have lots of examples. That's what extend the example means. That example has to be representative of the category. There needs to be lots of similar examples. Then you can legitimately draw a conclusion. So here's an example of good inductive reasoning. When Staff Sergeant Wesley Black returned home from Afghanistan with severe stomach pain, The VA hospital diagnosed him with irritable bowel syndrome caused by stress, but he later learned that he had stage 4 lung, liver, and colorectal cancer, leaving him only 3 to 5 years to live. According to the nonprofit organization Burn Pits 360, Wesley is one of tens of thousands of veterans with serious health problems caused by toxic fumes from burn pits and misdiagnosed from the VA. There's obviously a widespread problem with how the VA is handling diagnosis, a problem we must resolve to make sure our veterans get the care and support they need. So the example being used here is the one of Staff Sergeant Wesley Black. That's the yellow. The many thousands of other examples is the blue, and the conclusion is the green, that something obviously needs to be done. Then we have reasoning from analogy. This is when we reason by comparing one thing to something else that's similar to it, and say that because those things are similar, what's true for one thing may also make it true for the other thing. So we need to describe the known case, then the case we're comparing it to, then we draw the conclusion. So let's say we're arguing for changes in our healthcare system. We could use Canada's healthcare system as an example and say, look, we have some things in common. Maybe we could make ours more like theirs, like this. Canada's publicly funded healthcare system, known as Medicare, is actually 13 different healthcare insurance plans. Under this system, all Canadians have reasonable access to medical services without paying out of pocket. Given that the current Obamacare healthcare system has a somewhat similar system in place, it might be feasible to create a U.S. healthcare structure more in line with Canada's system, thus making healthcare more accessible and affordable. So you describe the known case, which is Canada's healthcare system. You apply those qualities to another case, in this case our current Obamacare system, and draw the conclusion that since those things are somewhat the same, they're not obviously equal, but maybe we could make our system closer to Canada's system. Okay, now let's look at the different ways we mess up reasoning, and those are known as fallacies. Sometimes we think we're getting the reasoning right, but we're not. Other times we don't care and we know it's not right, but we're just trying to win an argument, so we're being manipulative and coercive, and we just want to get what we want. Either way, it's wrong. Fallacies are logical errors in reasoning. Understanding these common weaknesses in reasoning can help you avoid them in your own presentations and recognize them in the reasoning of others. Just because an argument sounds good doesn't mean it's logical. Just because an argument is persuasive doesn't mean it's logical. Just because you agree with an argument doesn't mean it's correct. And remember, people are persuaded by bad arguments all the time. Don't be one of those people. Okay, let's look at the different ways people mess up arguments. False authority. Here's a very common fallacy. We simply buy into what somebody says without stopping to consider whether they have any business saying it. A source has false authority when their credentials are not relevant to the claims that they make. So whatever knowledge or experience they have isn't a match with the claim they're making. Now, of course, anybody can say anything about anything they want. There isn't a law that you can only make claims about things you're an expert in. However, when you need to make important decisions about what to think or do, and those decisions could impact your future, then maybe the expertise of the person you're listening to, their education, their experience as it relates to the topic, those things might be important. So even if this person is your friend and you trust them on other issues, you might want to maybe get the advice of someone with more experience on the topic at hand. I mean, you could ask me for advice about your speech, and that would be good. But it would be a really bad idea to ask me about your math homework because I suck at it. People who have genuine authority in one subject or field can be false authorities when they make claims about subjects outside their expertise or experience. Like, my nail lady told me to try this diet she's on. She does a great job on my nails. I guess I'll give it a try. Really, That doesn't make a lot of sense. Just because you saw it on Reddit or TikTok or wherever doesn't mean the person who said it knows what they're talking about. Remember, an expert is someone who has education, knowledge, and experience on the topic being discussed. Then there's the fallacy of personal attack, also known as the ad hominem fallacy. This is an attempt to discredit a person's argument by focusing not on the argument itself, but on some aspect of the person's qualities, characteristics, or background, none of which has anything to do with the topic being discussed. So, while it's irrelevant, it tends to move the focus off the argument and onto the person. These kinds of fallacies are insulting and often cruel. They're usually used so that the person doing them doesn't have to defend their own stand on the topic, which is probably not very strong, so they just insult the other person instead. Like this one, I could never vote for her. Look at the way she dresses. Well, it should be obvious that insults and personal attacks are not sound reasoning. Speakers use them with surprising frequency, and all you have to do is look at our political landscape, and it's constant. Don't do this. Unrepresentative examples are also known as weak analogy fallacies. Unrepresentative examples draw conclusions by comparing things that are not really comparable in the specific way in which you're comparing them. Here's an example of this fallacy. Guns are like hammers. Both are made of metal and can kill someone. Hammers do not need to be registered or regulated. Why should guns be registered or regulated? Yeah, this is a really bad argument I've seen many times before. People think they're really slick when they throw this out there, but it's stupid. Guns and hammers indeed do have these things in common, but that's pretty much all they have in common. What they don't have in common is the main thing that each of these things are used for. Hammers mainly are used for building things. Yes, you can kill someone with them, but you gotta get all up close and personal with someone and expend a lot of energy to do that. Guns, on the other hand, are not used to build things, but rather to destroy things, living things basically, and you don't have to be anywhere near that living thing to kill it. So no, those two objects are nothing alike, and that is a bad comparison and a bad argument. Then we have overgeneralization. Overgeneralization, also known as the hasty generalization fallacy, is coming to a conclusion based on a sample size that is far too small. We do this by arriving at a false conclusion based on limited information. Like these: sushi is disgusting. I had some once and it was terrible. Nobody should ever eat that stuff. Or this one: my sister-in-law's aunt got the COVID vaccine and had some bad side effects. I'm not getting that vaccine. It's dangerous. Okay, this first example, you had sushi once. You didn't like it. So your conclusion is that nobody should ever eat it. You're using your one experience to come to a conclusion for the whole rest of the world. Okay, then that's obviously hasty generalization. The next one, well, okay, you are basing your conclusion on your sister-in-law's aunt's experience, which is one person. However, if you do a little research, it's true that some people had worse than usual side effects from the COVID vaccines. But despite all the gloom and doom pundits out there trying to persuade you not to get your booster shots, these kinds of side effects are vanishingly rare, and they generally subside within a few days or weeks. But if you don't get the vaccine and then you get COVID, you could end up with long COVID, which again is not too common, but is much more common than COVID vaccine side effects. And that could last for years. And COVID is still out there, people, just saying. Okay, let's move on to confusing correlation and causation, also known as the false cause fallacy. A correlation is an association or relationship between two things. Causation is a special type of correlation where one thing leads to another. Confusing correlation with causation involves assuming that one thing causes another when the two things occur around the same time. So things might be correlated somehow, but that doesn't mean one thing caused the other thing to happen. In fact, sometimes the only relationship between two things is that one thing happened before the other thing, or occurred around the same time as the other thing. And here are some examples. Thinking that the current president causes high inflation. Those two things are correlated, but it's not necessarily true that whoever the current president is the cause of high inflation. Lots of things can cause high inflation. Believing that wearing your lucky jersey helps your team win. That's magical thinking. Thinking that every time you wash your car, it rains. Another example of magical thinking. You are the rain god. Believing that vaccines cause autism. That is definitely confusing correlation with causation, but a lot of people believe that. Children on the autism spectrum tend to start showing signs of autism right around the time when they also are getting those vaccines for measles, mumps, and rubella. There's overwhelming evidence to show that that timing is correlated, but there's no causal link between vaccines and autism. Ideally, presenting your audience with sufficient evidence and sound reasoning should show them both why you believe your thesis and why they should as well. However, audiences are made up of humans, and humans don't often reason based on logic alone. They tend to reason based on their emotions, and they are thinking about beliefs they already hold. To reason effectively, you need to present your evidence in a way that appeals to your audience. Confirmation bias is our tendency to interpret new evidence in ways that support our existing beliefs. People don't like to be wrong, so they tend to defend their preconceived ideas rather than consider your evidence and reason with an open mind. That's called motivated reasoning, and that involves using reasoning to protect their already existing beliefs. There's something called the evidence wish list and the building bridges exercises that I will put underneath this video. Now, the topics that you'll be dealing with in this class, I don't think there's going to be any that there will be a lot of pushback on, but there might be some that need some explanation so the audience can see what the problem is that needs to be solved. However, out there in the real world, you might be sometimes dealing with a somewhat hostile audience, and they might be a little mistrustful of you. So you need to give them reasons to trust you, giving them trustworthy sources and being a trustworthy person and an ethical person, helping them to understand and interpret your ideas in ways to make sense to them will help. So do your best to look at your reasoning and evidence and focus on things that you believe will best appeal to your audience and help to get your point across. This is the end of the lecture on chapters 16, 10, and 7.